This is a summative review of Unit 5, the Antebellum period through the Civil War. Essential information. Sectional tensions during the early 1800s, the antebellum period before the Civil War, were caused by competing economic interest. In the North, the industrialized North favored high protective tariffs, or taxes, on imported goods to protect factories from foreign competition. The growth of railroads and canals helped the growth of an industrialized economy, as this political cartoon demonstrates below. In contrast, the agricultural South opposed or was against high tariffs that made the price of imports more expensive. Sectional tensions were also caused by the westward movement, westward expansion. The belief that it was America's manifest destiny to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific provided political support for territorial expansion, as depicted in this famous painting of manifest destiny in the westward movement. As new states entered the Union, however, compromise needed to be made that would maintain the balance of power in Congress between free states and slave states. One of the first compromises regarding the issue of slave versus free was the Missouri Compromise. Missouri was the first state in the Louisiana Purchase territory that would be ready for statehood. This would draw a line, the 3630 line, an east-west line through the Louisiana Purchase territory. Slavery was prohibited or not allowed above the line, but was allowed below the line. The only exception would be Missouri. Missouri was above the line, but it was admitted as a slave state, balanced by Maine, which entered as a free state. American migration to Texas led to an armed revolt against Mexican rule and the famous Battle of the Alamo, in which a band of Texans fought to the last man against a vastly superior Mexican force. The Texans' eventual victory over Mexican forces later or subsequently brought Texas into the Union as a slave state. This was mainly because it was slaveholders that had settled Texas, looking for fresh cotton land. The American victory in the Mexican War during the 1840s led to the acquisition of an enormous territory that included the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of Colorado, and New Mexico. In the Compromise of 1850, California entered as a free state, as it had been settled by free people looking for gold in the '49 gold rush, while the new southwestern territories acquired from Mexico would decide on their own. This was a concept known as popular sovereignty. The fugitive slave law, which required fugitive slaves to be returned back to the South, pitted Southern slave owners against outraged Northerners who opposed returning escaped slaves to bondage. This was also part of the Compromise of 1850. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed or overturned the Missouri Compromise line by allowing people north of the line in Kansas and Nebraska territory to choose on their own. Again, the doctrine of popular sovereignty. The states would decide, the people would decide. This essentially overturned the concept that this would be free territory, as had been provided for by the Missouri Compromise. This law produced bloody fighting in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces battled each other for the future of Kansas. It also led to the birth of the Republican Party that opposed the expansion of slavery. This will become an issue later because Southerners will associate the Republican Party as a party of abolitionists who wanted to get rid of slavery in the country. when in reality the Republican Party was born to oppose the expansion of slavery in the free territory. Sectional tensions were at heart caused by the institution of slavery as we get closer to the Civil War. Northerners, led by William Lloyd Garrison, whose picture you see here, published The Liberator. This was an anti-slavery newspaper. He argued that slavery was a violation of Christian principles and called for its immediate abolition or end. Frederick Douglass, whose picture you also see here, a younger version and then an older version, was a former enslaved African American who became a prominent black abolitionist and urged President Lincoln during the Civil War to recruit former enslaved African Americans to fight in the Union Army. Abolitionist author Harriet Beecher Stowe exposed the horrors of slavery to many Northern readers in her publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, she depicts the brutal beatings of a beloved slave on the plantation called Uncle Tom. To many Northern readers, this was the first time they started to think about the horrors of slavery. Southerners, on the other hand, come to the defense of slavery, so we have the sectional divisions intensifying through the 1850s. At the same time, in a related note, that the abolitionist movement was growing, another reform movement took root to give equal rights to women who were sympathizing with the position of slaves in the country. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's pictured here, and her friend Susan B. Anthony became involved in the women's suffrage movement before the Civil War. Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, and in the Seneca Falls Declaration called for women to be equal to men in the area of politics. She called for women's suffrage or voting rights. This movement continued after the war, and we'll talk more about women's suffrage into the 20th century. Slave revolts in Virginia, led by Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, fed white Southern fears about slave rebellions and led to harsh laws in the South against fugitive slaves. The U.S. Supreme Court also contributed to the intensification of the debate over slavery in the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Dred Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom on the basis of living in a free territory made him free. The court, however, decided that he was not a free man because slavery was a property right protected by the U.S. Constitution before the Civil War. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was followed by the secession of several Southern states, starting with South Carolina in 1860, and the Deep South, these were the Cotton states, that feared Lincoln, as a Republican, was an abolitionist. Fort Sumter, South Carolina, in 1861 was the opening confrontation of the war. Lincoln would later call up the troops to suppress the rebellion, and at that point the Upper South would also secede and join the Confederate States of America. To summarize, sectional tensions and failure to meet a political solution led to the Civil War that lasted between 1861 and 1865. Causes of the war included sectional debate over tariffs, the extension of slavery into the territories, and the nature of the Union, or states' rights, as we had seen with the nullification crisis. Northern abolitionists versus Southern defenders of slavery. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott, which upheld slavery and angered those who opposed slavery. Publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe that exposed the horrors of slavery. Even ineffective presidential leadership in the 1850s, as we failed to have strong leadership such as Buchanan, who we talked about being a dough-faced president, who did not provide solutions to the upcoming crisis of the 1860s. A history of failed compromises over the expansion of slavery. And finally, President Lincoln's call for troops after Fort Sumter intensified the sectional crisis and led to the Civil War. The Civil War, most importantly, put the constitutional government to its most important test, as the debate over the power of the federal government versus states' rights reached a climax. The survival of the United States as one nation was at risk, and the nation's ability to bring to reality the ideas of liberty, equality, and justice depended on the outcome of the war.